Okay, in this video we're going to go through company preferences. Now I'm doing this in the QuickBooks Enterprise edition, so there will be some more preferences than what you would see in Pro and Premier. If you feel like you need any of those additional features, make sure and contact us and we can get you an enterprise quote. Okay, up under Edit, we go to Preferences, and then we have My Preferences, which again is in another video, but we're going to start with Company Preferences, and basically we're just going to work our way right down this list. Okay, there's a lot, so get prepared. All right, so Company Preferences can be, you have to have the permissions to access them, of course. Not everybody can access them. These are system-wide changes. All right, in Accounting, that's the first one up top here. We're going to click on Company Preferences. You can choose to turn on account numbers here. Okay, if I turn on account numbers, it doesn't do anything, change anything in my chart of accounts. It just unlocks that field, so now I can see it. All right. When you use account numbers in QuickBooks, when I go to my chart of accounts, right, I can come in and I can enter a bill, and under the expenses tab, I can type rent, right, and it'll come up with rent, or I can type $62.95. Now, a lot of people are used to using account numbers in their accounting file. They're not necessary. If you're not going to use them, turn them off. When you hire new staff, it takes them a while to remember those account numbers, but the fact that they can type rent or $62.95, then that's incredibly helpful. Okay, so accounting preferences, company preferences, use account numbers. Again, if we turn it off at any point, it doesn't delete those numbers, it just hides that field. All right, we can require accounts, which is a default. We can show the lowest sub-account only. What that would mean is instead of seeing, you can see over here, I've got prepaids $12.50 and I've got prepaid taxes, prepaid insurance. So instead of seeing the prepaids, the $12.50 total of these two, it would just show the $12.52 and the $12.55. I've never had a client that needs that. Okay, class tracking. So class tracking in QuickBooks is similar to department tracking. A class field is incredibly important, and we will have other videos on classes down the road. But class tracking allows you to enter a class on transactions, right? So on the bill, again, if I have class tracking turned on, I'm going to have that field. On the invoice, I'll have that field. So that field's a really powerful field. It allows us to do things like run profit and loss by class, do budgets by class. Again, it's a way to look at it as almost like a department. So in other accounting packages, a lot of times the department will be a sub GL code, right? So rent for department 1 will be 6000-001. Rent for department 2 is 6000-002, and our chart of accounts gets really long. Okay, so in QuickBooks, we use class tracking to segregate those out by department, and then we just have to have one GL account code for rent. All right, so we can prompt to assign classes if you want to give it a warning. If you forget to put a class in, it'll warn you. You can also, and this is an enterprise preference, assign classes to accounts, meaning on your chart of accounts. You can assign it to items, or you can assign it to names. Okay, so as an example, if you have a service department and a product department, and you want to make sure that anytime you add a service item to a invoice or a bill, that it defaults to that department, then you would choose items here. And when I choose items, when I go look at my list for my item list, I have that class field drop down in here. I know I'm jumping around, but there's a lot of information. Pause and rewind. Okay, moving along. We can automatically assign a journal entry number. Okay, so it picks up based off the last journal entry number. Preference, again, you can turn that off. You can warn when you're posting to retained earnings. All right, that's just a helpful tip. You can hide opening balance fields in names and items. So this is something that's new. I believe it's enterprise only as well. What that does, if you come in, and we have videos on this again when we set up new customers, but if you come in to your customers and you create a new customer or a new job or a new vendor or whatever it is, you have this open balance field, right? And most pro advisors, most QuickBooks advisors want you to hide that field, because if you put information in that field, like let's say I have a new customer called ABC and they have an open balance of $500 with me, it's going to post that to opening balance equity instead of posting it to the appropriate income account, as an example, or cost of goods sold, or whatever it is. So we don't really like people. We definitely don't advise people to use that field. So when we go in and set up our customers' files, we want to click that box that says hide that opening balance field. So when I do that, I say okay. Now when I say new customer, it's not really hidden, but it's grayed out, so I can't put anything in there. Okay. All right, date warnings. So you can warn if transactions are more than 90 days in the past. 60 days, you can change that. Okay, it's just a helpful hint because of some of the preferences that you'll see on the My Preferences side when it comes to dates. And then also if they're more than 30 days in the future. Again, these kinds of things also help at year end, right? It's year end and I'm posting to 12/1 and I'm so used to just putting, 12/01 and not putting the year. But if I do that and it's January 1st, 2016, as an example, and I push 12/01, it's going to put it to 12/1, 2016 because it's going to default to the current year. Okay, also in company preferences, this is a preference that you do not have to be in single user mode to edit. So this is the closing date password. So you can come in here. The first thing to note, you can exclude estimate sales orders, purchase orders, so non-posting transactions are not held up by closing dates. Okay, so you most likely, if you're using those and you're using the closing date password, you want to check that box. You put the closing date in here. Okay. This closing date means that anybody who has access to this password can post to the prior period, right? So post to any dates prior to that closing date. Okay, so it doesn't have to be admin who has it. Sometimes we'll close off like the sales department, right? Doesn't have access to post to a closed period, but the accounting department does. Okay, and one of the reports that we have in here is that we have a report that will show you, right, closing date exception report. So anytime somebody has put in that password and posted to a closed period, then it'll show up on that report. Okay. Again, this is another place where I will put in the password, right, for our customers. I'll put in my name as the password because then anytime they're posting to a closed period, they have to think of me before they do it. Okay, moving down, bills for company preferences. All right, so this is going to be a default, right? You set up at the vendor level what our terms are with that vendor. But if the vendor doesn't have a term set up with them, this is going to be our default. So default bills are due 30 days after. We do want to warn about duplicate bill numbers from the same vendor, right? So if someone in AP puts in a bill and then somebody else goes in and gets an email copy of that same bill and tries to put it in, we want it to warn us, right? Automatically use credits. What this is, if we have a vendor credit, it'll automatically apply it to the bill. I don't like that one being on necessarily. I want to choose which bill to apply it to, and then automatically use discounts as well. So that's helpful. So if we have terms with the vendor of 2%, 10, net 30, right? So we want the system to automatically calculate those discounts, and we want to stick it to this GL account code, right? Early pay discounts is other income. Usually this is a cost of goods sold account. Okay. All right, moving down. Calendar, there's no calendar preferences for company. Checking. We can choose to print the account names on the voucher. That will be your general ledger account name. Okay. We can choose to change the check date when a non-cleared check is printed. So if I have a check that I have dated, January 1st, and it has not cleared my bank yet, but I need to reprint that check for any reason. Maybe I had accidentally marked it that it was printed and I didn't print it. Do I want it to change the check date to the current date? That's what happens there. You want to be careful with this because we have had companies that go in and they're going through an audit and they need to print out a whole bunch of checks, and they had this preference checked and all those checks came through to the current period. So just be aware. Okay, do we want to start with the payee field on a check? What that does is when I go in banking, write checks, notice it starts up top with which bank account. Okay, if you only have one bank account, you probably just want it to start in the payee field so you don't have to deal with it. Again, one that I usually leave checked. What about duplicate check numbers? That's always important. We don't want to have that. And then autofill payee account number in the check memo. So on the vendor, if I have set up an account number in there, when I enter a check to that vendor, it will pull from the vendor card the account number and put it on the check, right? So what that would be is if I have a utility bill and I have an account with the utility company, I want my account number to print on that check so that they know who it's coming from. All right. You can use default accounts for creating paychecks and payroll liabilities, right? So maybe you don't pay it out of the company checking account, you pay it out of the payroll account. So you can have defaults there. And then we have the bank feed section down here. There's lots of videos on bank feeds. You can choose to have the express mode, which is the mode that everybody is used to using now, current. It's been out there for several years now. Under the express mode, you can say create rules automatically, or you can turn that off. You can also say always ask before creating a rule, right? Which we do want to do. We don't want automatic rules happening. It's too easy for things to get jumbled. Okay. Sometimes I will even turn off the create rules automatically based on the customer's information. Then we have the classic mode. I'm wondering when this button's going to go away. This is the really old way of doing bank feeds in QuickBooks. Some people still like using it. If you want to turn on classic mode, you can do it there. All right, moving down, desktop view. This is going to allow us to say what we want to see on the home screen. Okay, so if I come in here, let me close out of some of these things. On my home screen, it's kind of jumbled right now, right? So let's say I don't do estimates, or maybe I don't have statement charges. So when I go into that preference, I can turn off sales receipts. Again, it does not remove it from the system. Okay, it's not gone, it's just hidden now. So if you in the future decide, oh, I'm going to have cash sales, I need to turn it back on, you can do it there. So let's just see what that looks like with those two. These guys are actually in other preferences down here, but it'll take us. So I want to turn off time tracking. So if I click this, it takes me down to time tracking, right? And then I can turn it off down there. Okay. So now that I turned off sales receipts and statements, let me look at my home screen here. Those are gone, right, off of my home screen. It makes it a little less cluttered. Okay, finance charges. What's our finance charge annual interest rate? The minimum finance charge, right? What's the minimum amount that you want to charge somebody? We don't want to be sending out, I mean, $1 even. Is it even worth your time to try and collect that? Maybe we make it $25. Grace period. When do we give them a grace period in order to pay? The finance charge account, right? And other interest income or finance charges income. Assess finance charges on overdue finance charges. So if they have a $25 finance charge, do I want to try and assess more charges on top of that? Calculate charges from the due date or from the invoice date, right? So is it retroactive to the date we were originally invoiced if they're late paying? And then when we create the finance charge invoices, do we want to mark them to be printed? There's other videos on finance charge setup and everything, so go ahead and check that out later. Okay, general company preferences. So we have show portions of an hour as a decimal, right, or as minutes. Again, just an internal preference, but this will be company-wide. Always show years as 4 digits. Never update name information when saving transactions, right? So on a customer invoice, I changed the address on the customer invoice, or I changed the, the email address or something like that. So when I hit save, do I want it to update the customer card with that information? Okay, usually it'll ask you. So, all right, save transactions before printing. This is also something I like leaving on because if, as an example, you have QuickBooks and somebody's allowed to create an invoice, but they don't have to save it before printing, they can print out the invoice and send it to your customer, not hit save, and you guys have no record of it. Okay, so definitely want to leave that checked. And then allow for sorting on transaction forms. So now in the newer versions of QuickBooks, on an invoice, you have your columns, right? Or on a sales order, you have your different columns that we've set up on our template here, and we can sort by those columns, right? Okay. So do you want to allow that to happen? Okie dokie. Going down, integrated applications. So these are any applications, third-party applications that are allowed to connect into your QuickBooks file. So you can say don't allow people to access this, or don't allow applications to access this company file. Notify the user before running any application. We can look at the properties, right? So this is one of our third-party applications that we work with in the trades industry frequently with Intuit Field Service. So I can go in and say, allow this application to read and modify this company, prompt me before, allow it to access sensitive client data, okay, sensitive customer data, and then I can see more details about it here. All right. I can also uncheck this, say I don't want this application to have access anymore. So the first time you have any third-party applications access your company file, it's going to pop up a box and say, do you want to allow it to have access? Okay. You can also remove it, as you can see here. Inventory. So this is where we come to turn on inventory and purchase orders. They go hand in hand. If you want to do purchase order tracking, but you don't have inventory, you still have to turn it on here. Okay, so that turns that on. Warn about duplicate purchase order numbers. That's important, right? So if you have two purchasing agents and you're putting in purchase orders and you want to make sure that, one starts a purchase order and then gets on the phone, doesn't finish it, and then the other one goes in and starts a purchase order and finishes it, they're going to have the same number. So it'll warn you, hey, somebody else already saved a purchase order with that number, and you want to use the next number. All right, when calculating quantity available for inventory, we want to deduct reserve for pending builds. If you are not a manufacturing company, uncheck this. It's just added stuff you don't need to see. Or quantity on a sales order. Okay, so be sure to watch our inventory videos in the future too to know what that means. Quantity available, not quantity on hand. Okay, warn if there's not enough inventory to sell. So it'll give you a warning. Do you want the warning when it exceeds quantity on hand, how many I have on the shelf? Or do you want the warning when it exceeds quantity available, right? So how many on the shelf minus what's on a sales order and a pending build? And then you can also say, don't allow negative quantities, period. All right. Then we have our advanced inventory settings in here in our company preferences. We have a whole other videos on advanced inventory, so I'm not going to go into that here, but make sure to check those out. Our units of measure, we can disable units of measure. We can have single units of measure, which I don't really find very helpful. Those are more just like FYIs, right? I buy by the case. I sell by the case. That's it. Multiple units of measure, though, are important, especially, again, with inventory. I buy by the case. I sell by the each, right? So setting up multiple units of measure, this is where you turn that on. We have enhanced inventory receiving. This is something that is a really big deal. This is enterprise only. And when you turn this on, you cannot turn it off, so don't do it without talking with somebody. And again, we have other videos on that, but this is where you go enable it. Then we have our automatic cost and price updates. Again, this is enterprise only. So in this area, we can say for all items, right? You have the option at the individual item level, but this is going to be the default for all items. Our markup is a percent over cost or an amount over cost. If the item cost changes on a purchase, right? Meaning on the bill, I have changed the price, the cost of my item. I want it to ask me if I want to update the item card, right? The default cost. I want to always update the default cost, or I want to never update the cost. Okay. When the item cost changes on the sales side, right? The default sales price for this item, always update, never update, ask about updating it. Right? Sometimes these preferences can get a little annoying, the pop-ups are, but now you know where you can go turn them on and fix it, right? So you'd say never update if you don't want it to bug you all the time. Okay, for assembly items, use auto-updated BOM cost as the assembly cost, and then when BOM's cost changes, update the sales price. So this is just the same thing as what we're saying up here, but this is for assembly items. Moving down, we have our job estimates, jobs and estimates preferences. So we have different job statuses in QuickBooks. So if you don't want it to be pending, you want to rename it something else, you can change, maybe awarded, we say 1, I don't know. So if you have different terminology internally that you use for those, you can change those here. You can turn estimates on or off here, as well as progress invoicing on or off here. Okay. You can close estimates after converting it to an invoice. Okay, that's a preference here. Don't print items that have a $0 amount, right? So on the estimate, let's say we have 10 lines on the estimate, but we're only billing for 3 of those lines. QuickBooks will bring over the entire 10 lines, but you can say, I don't want the ones that have $0 amount printed. I might see them on my screen, but I don't want them printed. And then, of course, warn about duplicate estimate numbers. Okay. We have multiple currencies. This is where we go turn on multiple currencies. I always suggest that somebody talk with a pro advisor, call us before doing this, so you can know the effects. We want to test it first. Payments. Okay, so we can automatically apply payments. Basically what that means is when you go into receive payment, it's going to pick the oldest ones first unless it finds an exact match. So I say I've got a $500 payment from a customer. If I have a $500 invoice, it'll match those up. If I have a $200 invoice and a $700 invoice, it's going to automatically apply $200 to the one and then the $300 against the later $700 one. So automatically calculate payments, checking that off. What that does is when you receive a payment, instead of putting an amount up top necessarily, you just want to check off this invoice was paid, this invoice was paid, this invoice was paid, and QuickBooks will calculate for you what the check amount should be. And then we can have undeposited funds as a default deposit to account. If you have clearing accounts, web store clearing, if you have, I don't know, different account types, maybe you deposit straight to a bank or something like that, you can uncheck this box. Unchecking this box, all it does is when I go in to customers receive payments, right, I have to choose where I'm depositing it to. Okay. Okay, online payments. So do we want the default to be that our customers can pay by online payment, credit card, or ACH? That if I check these off, anytime I set up a new customer, it will default that the customer can pay online. If you have questions about this, let us know. There's many other videos on it as well. Payroll employees, this is a company preference. Do we have payroll, yes or no? Or are we using online payroll? We can go in and set up there's videos on payroll, of course. So pay stub and voucher printing, right? Our preferences for that. What do we want to print on them? Our workers' compensation, right? Do we track workers' compensation? Our sick and vacation, how are we accruing our sick or vacation? Okay. We can copy earnings details from previous paychecks and when we create the paychecks. We can recall quantity fields on paychecks. We can recall hour fields on paychecks, right? So remember what happened last time. If we're doing job costing, we want to check this off so that the jobs show up on the time cards and or on the payroll information that we're putting in. And Down here, we can assign a class, right, or department, either to the entire paycheck or per line on the paycheck, right, per earnings item. So if you have people who are in the service department versus product department, they don't cross over, you may want to just choose it for the entire paycheck, because then you don't have to fill it in on every line. How do we want to display our employees' names? First name first, last name first. We have employee defaults. Okay, so if you have a whole bunch of people who work, I don't know, on the production line, and they have default earnings that we offer, so you can set up the default information. So anytime you create an employee, this will fill in, and then of course on each individual employee, you can edit it. Okay. But certain things would be helpful, right? Pay frequency, if you guys are always on the same pay frequency, you always have the same payroll schedule. Some of these fields it'll pre-fill in for you, so it's helpful. All right, we can select to mark new employees as sales reps, so it'll create them as a sales rep automatically, and then also display employee social security numbers in headers on reports. Somebody must ask for that at one point. I don't know. Reminders. This is where we set up our company reminders, right? In the newer versions of QuickBooks, we have our reminders up top here. So which reminders do you want to show in summary, show in detail, and then if you don't want to be reminded about these things, and then when to remind you. Reports and graphs. So company preferences, again, do we want, anytime I run a P&L, do I want it to default to accrual basis or cash basis? It's a default. You can always change it on the report. We recommend accrual. Okay. Aging. Does the aging happen on reports from the due date or from the original transaction date? So in accounts receivable, most times, if I have an invoice and it's due in 30 days, right, the due date is 30 days. But if you want it to be showing that they have 30 days to pay, but the aging, you want it to start from the date of the original invoice, you would flip that here. I have very few people who have ever asked for that. When you're looking at reports, you want to show items by name only. If you do by name and description, it'll show the item name, and then in parentheses, it'll have that description. Sometimes those descriptions can get pretty long, but you can flip that around there. Also, when we're looking at accounts, do we want to see the name or the description, or name and description? So this is the chart of accounts. We can set up our statement of cash flows here, right? So it gives us, here's our operating, investing, financing, what it expects. If QuickBooks is wrong, you can move things around. Okay. And then we have a default formatting for reports. So I can come in there, say my company name, put a title, subtitle, right? Fonts and numbers. I can say I want, negatives in parentheses. I want it in red. So these are just the defaults for reports. Obviously, on each of the reports, you can modify those as well. Going down to sales and customers. All right, so our default shipping method to show up on sales forms, we usually send by FedEx. Maybe every once in a while, we'll have other options. So again, it's a default. You can change it on the transaction. Our usual FOB point, freight on board. Warn about duplicate invoice numbers, always important. This is where we choose our template for packing slips. So you have a packing slip that you can print from the sales order. There's also a packing slip you can print just from the invoice if you don't run sales orders through QuickBooks. Okay, and when you look at your template list, right, it's going to be an invoice template type. All right, so you want to make sure, because sales order may have a packing list as well, but you're going to be pulling from the invoice template type. So when I go into my preferences, I can choose my default, right, for packing slip. So again, on an invoice, when I hit print, it'll say print packing slip. This is what it's going to print out. I can enable the collection center. I always turn this on for customers. Keep an eye out for our videos on the collection center in the future. Okay, I can enable sales orders. I can warn about duplicate sales orders, print items with zero amounts when converting to an invoice, right? That was the same as the estimate to an invoice. If there's any that we're not shipping, if it's a $0 amount, don't print it. And then for sales orders, I can choose my default templates for packing slips and for pick lists, right? So if I'm going to print out a pick list, give it to my guys in the warehouse to go pull my items. Then you have the preference here. I think this is enterprise only. Do not sell to overdue customers. Don't do it, right? So if a customer has a balance past due, not allowed. Okay, custom pricing. So this is enterprise only. QuickBooks has price levels. I think it's it's Premier and Enterprise. So price levels are essentially you have a customer who is a wholesale customer. They buy from you all the time. They get a 10% discount on all products, or they get a 10% discount on certain products, right? Advanced pricing is a little bit different than that. Advanced pricing allows you to kind of put higher level. There's a lot more parameters to it. It's not just associated with the customer. It could be associated with all products from a particular vendor, or could be from a particular class or department. So advanced pricing videos in the enterprise area, so make sure to check that out. Sales tax. Do we charge sales tax? Yes or no? We can add sales tax items here. Our default taxable item code, non-taxable item code, and when we print an invoice, do we want a little T to print on the line that shows that this line is taxable? Okay. When do you owe sales tax? On an accrual basis or cash basis? So upon payment from the customer, or as soon as you create that invoice? And then how often do you pay sales tax? Okay. Search. Okay, this little search up top here. This search is different than the find in QuickBooks. Control F. This search basically caches the data so that it can be searched faster. So what it does is, if you have it update automatically every 60 minutes, it basically takes a screenshot of the database, loads it in the search so that I can search quickly. You can choose to update it now here. You can also, when you go into the search here, choose to update it now. But if you just entered a transaction and then you're trying to find it right away, you need to make sure to update it, because otherwise, it's only updating every 60 minutes. Send forms. So this is where we default what we want it to look like when we send an email. Okay. So company preferences default method is email, right? Or we can choose mail, which would mark it to be printed. The email templates, right? So we have invoice estimate, sales orders, etc. All these different template types, which we can set up. So if I look at my statements, it's going to have a different template, right? Versus my purchase orders, different template. I can also BCC. Maybe you want to BCC accounting at fourlane.com on all these, right? So you can BCC somebody whenever you send emails out. Then we can go in and we can edit those templates. So in here, invoices, this is the name of the template. Here's the subject, right? And then here's some information that we're going to have in the email. You can insert certain fields here, right? So transaction number, transaction total. You can, instead of sincerely, say thank you, right? You can change the defaults here and then save them. Service connection. Okay. So when we're connecting to payroll, bank feeds, etc., automatically connect without asking for a password. Always ask for a password before connecting. And then if we want to allow for background downloading of service messages, maybe from our bank, etc. Spelling preferences, there aren't any. That's on an individual basis. Tax and 1099s, right? Do we file 1099s, yes or no? So we're most likely yes. Most companies do. And then time and expenses. Do you track time, yes or no? What is the first day of your work week, right? And this is just for running reports when we're looking at them. Do we want to mark all time entries as billable? So it'll default check off that billable box, or you can turn that off. Do we create invoices from time and expenses, yes or no? When you check this off, it'll pop up, right? If you have billable time or costs to invoice your client for, then it'll pop up a box and say, hey, you've got billable time and costs. It's also on the transaction itself on the invoice. You can add it there. Track reimbursed expenses as income. Okay. Mark all expenses as billable. Again, on a bill, right? So up top here, we're talking about on a time card, but on a bill, a check, a credit card purchase, if you put a customer name in there, do we want it to default to billable? And when we are tracking reimbursed expenses, what's our default markup percentage and default markup account? I went through those quickly. Hopefully you learned a lot, and that is company preferences inside of QuickBooks.